Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hi, I'm Dr. Elaine Ng. I'm calling from Toronto in Canada, where it's gloomy and cold and all that. Anyways, thank you for joining our webinar today. For those of you who are not IPSS members, please consider joining the organization so that IPSS can continue to promote and support multidisciplinary simulation-based education, training, and research in all subspecialties that care for infants and children, and then be able to offer programs like this. So you can check out our website, which is ipssglobal.org, and see the benefits of membership. The reason I joined is so that I can be hanging out with a bunch of simulation people, and I don't have to translate what adult people do for pediatrics. And I think it takes a special mindset, personality to work with children. So these are pretty fun, collaborative people. So I've been enjoying my time with them. Anyways, before we start, a few quick housekeeping notes. Feel free to post questions during the session. You can see that on your little screen on the side. In the upper right side panel of your computer screen, you'll see a control panel, and you can type the question or comment and submit it to the webinar organizers, which is me, basically, and I'll read them at the end because we'll reserve some time at the end for questions and answers. So as introduction, today Dr. Calhoun will discuss strategies for creating successful IPSSW conference abstracts. Information will also be provided on the selection process itself. The session will conclude with an open question and answer period. So Dr. Aaron Calhoun is a tenured associate professor in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Louisville and attending physician in the Just for Kids Critical Care Center at Norton Children's Hospital. He got his training, he got his education at Johns Hopkins and completed his training, residency and fellowship at Children's Memorial Hospital and Children's Hospital in Boston. And so he currently directs the simulation program at Norton Children's Hospital, and he's done tons in the field of simulation and medical education. So he's the perfect person to talk about this because he's got his own research interests, he's carried out leadership positions, and he's been on the abstract review committees and education committees for SSIH and also for IPSSW. So he can tell us all the inside details of how to get an abstract accepted and how to write the proper one so they won't be so easily rejected. I think I'll stop there on that note, and I'll hand over to Aaron.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Elaine. Glad for all of you that can be on this afternoon. As Elaine mentioned, please feel free to enter questions into the portal here, and then we'll answer them once the presentation's over. But right now I'm going to go through just some materials on the abstract selection process, and hopefully you can use this to get an edge on your future submissions. So just to sort of go through the obligatory disclosures, I don't have any of relevance or of note to this presentation. And we're going to talk a bit about abstracts at IPSSW, the categories, what those categories mean, what each category is looking for, so you can get a clear sense of that. We're going to look at a successful abstract. I chose the perhaps hardest to get into category, the research abstracts. And so we're going to be analyzing a research abstract and hopefully getting some useful tips on how to write one that will wow the reviewers and get in there as an oral presentation. But note that many of those strategies will also be viable for innovation and work in progress as well, and I'll share those differences with you. And then finally, just to give you a sense of exactly how the selection process runs, I think that I find it helpful when I know exactly what happens once the abstract leaves my desk between that point to the point where it comes back as an accept or reject, to know really kind of what's happening, who's looking at it, how this works, and how people are thinking about it. And so hopefully at the end you'll have a clear idea of how the process works, and you can use that to advance your careers in simulation forward. So first of all, I think it's just wise to talk about what the goals of conference abstracts are. I think the biggest one, of course, is to communicate new findings and innovations, in our case, in the pediatric simulation community. But I also think it's important to recognize, especially if there's any trainees on this call, I don't know the demographics of who's with us, but if there are any trainees on the call, it's also an opportunity to network with other members of the community that you might not have a chance to interact with otherwise. And also you can gather feedback on future plans for research and project development. And I would also add that I found my current job that I've been in for 13 years presenting an abstract at a conference. So there's a lot of reasons why it's important to get your work out there: scientific reasons, personal reasons, group reasons, and growth reasons. So let's talk about IPSSW abstract categories at first to give you a sense of what the lay of the land looks like. And so IPSS divides abstracts into 4 categories. We'll go through each one in turn, but the first is research. The second is innovation. The third is a category called ideas and works in progress. And finally, workshops. And so research abstracts, these types of abstracts are really focused on disseminating new knowledge. And they really have 2 specific aspects to them. Number 1, is that knowledge something that's going to advance the field? And number 2, is the methodology that's employed consistent with the specific research question or hypothesis that you're asked? These are the most rigorous because they both contain an element of innovation. The question has to be an interesting, useful question to the field to be scored highly. And the methodology matters. You can have the most interesting, vibrant question in the world, but if you investigate it using a suboptimal methodology, it's not going to do well in the process. It's not just about what you're asking, it's about how you're going about it. And then finally, the results have to be clearly presented and interpreted in a way that really makes clear what you found. Going to innovation abstracts, these are more purely focused on developments in education, developments in patient safety with a simulation focus, of course, development in simulation in terms of systems integration, in terms of technology. A lot of this language I'm literally lifting verbatim from the design documents for IPSS, so this is what you're going to find in the evaluations and everything. The key for an evaluation abstract is that it really has to clearly describe the problem that the innovation is addressing, as well as the innovation itself. Why do we care about what you're doing? What does this actually do to move the field forward, to move our practice forward, or maybe on a more focused level? What can another center take from this and use to bring their pediatric simulation forward in a new and interesting way? It's got to take things forward a bit. And you also have to clearly describe exactly what you did. People have to be able to see and understand the nature of the innovation. This last line here I think is important. You do not need to have evaluated your innovation for submission, but you need to be honest, the presence of some evaluation, something to indicate that it worked, that it made a difference, whether in terms of learner satisfaction, whether in terms of organizational acceptance. This is less focused on data than research, but something to say that this innovation actually began or is somehow making the difference that you hoped it would make will always bump that abstract up to another level in terms of how it's reviewed. So when you're writing an innovation abstract, carefully consider what you can add in terms of evaluation. Carefully consider what you might know in terms of how that works and how that can be presented in a truthful yet comprehensive way. Workshop abstracts. These are literally proposals for workshops. These are interactive educational sessions. These need to be based explicitly, I should add, on sound educational theory and practice. You need to be able to articulate clearly what you're trying to teach and why you're going to be teaching it in the way that you are teaching it. It also has to be collaborative. Occasionally we'll get abstracts for this in other conferences for interactive educational sessions where it will really, when you read it, you're like, you know what, this is more of a lecture. We're not looking for lectures. I think everybody knows that lectures, at least in our field of simulation, that lectures in some ways are good, but in many ways are suboptimal for the adult learner. And we're looking for ways that people can come, hear your ideas, and have an interactive experience where they get to explore, play with those ideas, move them forward, and practice them a bit. And so for these to really succeed, the attendee there has to be something in that abstract that tells us how you're going to involve the attendees in active learning, active participation throughout the bulk of that time. And then finally, ideas and works in progress. Pick the Sagrada Familia, since it has been a work in progress for quite some time. And the goal of these is really focusing on the idea itself, but it's an idea that's under development. It's an idea that you want more information about how to explore. You want to talk about your sort of thoughts as to where to go with it, but you also want to get feedback as to what to do with it. The value of an idea and works in progress is fundamentally the ability to make a course correction in what you're doing based on the feedback of expertise. So how do we gauge these, given that things haven't actually happened yet? Well, it's about how clearly you describe the idea or concept on which it's based, the question that it's intended to answer, and how well you've described the background and reason that needs to happen, and the kind of plan that you've put forth so far. That plan doesn't have to be final, but we at least need to know in a relative amount of detail what you're intending to do as of this moment to address that issue. I should note that these can also be research-oriented. These can be research questions you're trying to answer, or they can be innovation-oriented. I want to develop a program that does X. Both are fair game for consideration here. So just to give you a sense, I was scientific chair for IPSSW 2019, and here are the acceptance statistics for that. This just gives you a sense of, with everything that was submitted, what we accepted. So first of all, recognize that for research, for innovation, and for ideas and works in progress, we split those into posters and oral presentations. Oral presentations are typically given probably about an 8 to 10 minute block to actually present your ideas with a limited number of slides and to get feedback in that session. Poster presentations are just that, a standard poster presentation. And we typically base whether an idea is placed in the oral category or whether an abstract is placed in the poster category based on the overall score, and we'll get to that in a moment. We have a limited number of oral slots, and so we tend to start from the top and fill those slots from the top to the bottom, and then the rest of the abstracts that fit within our parameters for acceptance will go as posters. So you definitely, if you want an oral, you want to try to get a higher score on your abstracts. Just to give you a sense of how the breakdown is, for poster presentations, about 50% were accepted as 50% of the research ones were accepted as posters, 55 as innovation of the innovations were accepted as posters, and 51% of ideas and works in progress. Orals, it was a little lower. It was 45, 43, and 41%. And then interactive workshops, these are only oral. There's no real such thing as an interactive poster. It's not kind of a thing. And so 92% of those total were accepted. And of all the abstracts that were submitted, 8 were rejected. So another important question to answer is, why do abstracts get rejected? And we can really attribute that to, I would say, about 5 main things. First of all, for research, the methodology is not adequate for the study. If you are submitting a completed research abstract, the methodology, the evaluative approach, the statistics, the design of the study, these really have to be adequate to answer the question that you're putting forth. If the methodology doesn't work, that's a primary reason for a research abstract to be rejected. Second, and this applies a little bit more to innovation, the project or question has insufficient novelty. It's something that's been done a number of times. Now, to be truthful here, if you are doing a research abstract, there is value in replication. There is value in incremental improvements. There is value in moving a question forward step by step and replicating old results. But again, a lot of that's going to depend on the strength of the methodology as well. For an abstract that's an innovation, in the innovation category, really the abstract stands or falls on how new the idea is and what that idea does to really push things forward in a palpable way. So innovation abstracts that ultimately seem to have really been done before and seem to have a wide representation out there are not going to be graded highly and may be a cause for rejection. Project or study is not a good fit for the conference. Again, you'd be surprised at some of the things that get submitted. I've seen simulation abstracts submitted that are about simulation of biological membrane markers or things of that nature that clearly don't have anything to do with pediatric healthcare-based simulation. And so we'll simply reject those initially as abstracts that simply don't fit the conference. They may well fit another conference beautifully, but they don't fit ours. And perhaps the author was confused. But just make sure that the abstract you're submitting really fits the goals of the conference. Next, again, this goes with the methodology, but insufficient explanation. So how is this different than insufficient novelty or inadequate methodology? Well, this has to do with what you actually write. It is quite possible that you could have a brilliantly innovative abstract or an amazing methodology that cleverly answers the question, but you just didn't put enough explanation there for us to tell. Remember that abstract writing, we can't read minds. And so abstract writing is not just about what you know, it's about helping us know what you know so that we know exactly what you did. If the written text is not enough to tell us what we need to know about it, then we have to assume that it didn't happen, even if you did it already. So make sure that all the important things are included in your abstract. And then finally, inability to read the abstract. Occasionally we get an abstract that's just incomplete sentences, unable to read the language of it. And if we can't read it, we can't accept it, we can't evaluate it. And so those are main causes there. So let's go a bit into the anatomy of a successful abstract. I'm going to pick a research abstract. This is an abstract actually that, for full disclosure, this is not an IPSSW abstract. This is an abstract that I have access to because it's one that a mentee of mine wrote that we submitted to IMSH about 4 to 5 years ago. But we're going to go through it. It got an award. And so I figure it's a decent example of what a good abstract looks like if it got an award. And so we're going to go through it step by step so that you can see what a good abstract needs to include. So first of all, for a research abstract, we'll talk about the other kinds a little bit briefer. It's always safe to go with the classic scientific format: question, background, methods, results, conclusions. So here's the title. The title is When the Mannequin Dies, Creation and Exploration of a Theoretical Framework Using a Mixed Methods Approach. And the introduction says, controversy exists in the simulation community as to the emotional and educational ramifications of unplanned mannequin death on learners. No theoretical framework to guide future investigations of learner actions exists. The purpose of our study is to generate and explore a model of learner experience and mannequin death as a guide for future research using a mixed methods approach. So let's analyze this. First of all, this abstract has a clear descriptive title. As a reviewer, I can read this and know exactly what happens. They're looking at mannequin death. They're trying to create a theoretical framework, so it's probably going to have a heavy qualitative component, and they're going to use a mixed methods approach. Great. That gives me clear expectations as to what this study is going to look like. Looking at the introduction, one problem that I see often is that people will write an introduction that takes up, maybe half the word count or more. Keep in mind that these abstracts are word limited. You don't want to waste too much space on your background. 1 or at most 2 sentences suffice. If you want to spend words anywhere, you should spend words on your methods and on your results. So we tried to limit this to about 2 sentences. And then we had a very clear purpose statement. For a quantitative abstract, you need to have a hypothesis. That's ideal. For a qualitative, you need to have something more like a research question, which is a bit more vague, which is okay for a qualitative abstract. And that's what we have here. So descriptive title, brief but relatively descriptive sentences that explain why this is important, what you're building on, and a clear statement of purpose, hypothesis, or research question. Methods. I'm not going to read this in its entirety, but I'll give you a moment. I'll just summarize kind of what goes on in here. We mentioned that it was exempted from the IRB. We discussed the initial focus group phase, scripted questions, how we prepared the focus groups, how the transcripts were analyzed, how that was organized into a framework, and then we discussed how that was crafted into a subsequent survey that was used to gather qualitative or quantitative data on that, and the results were analyzed using a mixed method approach to refine the model, and I give the statistical tests we use. So to analyze this, number 1, I address ethics approval. This is important. We have to know that your research was done ethically, was done after appropriate IRB approval. If we have any sense that your abstract was not written after appropriate approval, it's grounds for rejection. We cannot accept that. We support the ultimate goals of the research community to be ethical. Next, you really have to have a clear sequential description of what was done in the abstract. People should be able, and granted this is an abstract, not a full paper, so you're not going to be able to get everything in there. We understand that. But people should be able, in large part, to be able to read back to you and say, yeah, I get it. I know what you did. I know the order of things you did. I might not be able to replicate the study based on this, but I could at least write an outline that you could fill in the details with and have it be correct. And then the final thing is describe your analysis. I've seen many abstracts that just talk about a methodologic approach and they never say what statistical test they use. They never say what kind of analytic methods they use. And so we're really left guessing as to whether the appropriate tests were done. That part doesn't have to be long, but if you're going to use a chi-square, say we used a chi-square. If you're going to do a qualitative assessment and use a thematic analysis, say we analyze them using thematic analysis. Let us know what you did to analyze, because a lot of the methodology really consists of, is this the right analysis for the kind of data that your abstract contains? Results, again, this is a rather longer paragraph, and so I'm not going to read it in its entirety, but note here how we structured this. So this was a more complicated abstract. If you're doing just a pure quantitative piece, it might not have this much data or details in it, but this was a 2-phase abstract. And so we provided here, you can see information about both sets of demographics, the clinicians that helped us with our focus groups and those to whom the survey was distributed. The qualitative approach, we described how we organized that into a framework. And in this case, we had the leeway of entering in a table So many times you'll be able to put a table into the abstracts that showed those themes. If I'd had more room here, we could have also listed the themes we got for that. Looking further below, you can see that whenever we discussed the statistical approach to this, we listed the actual stats we did. We gave the correlation coefficients. We gave the p-values. It is not enough to say the results were statistically significant. Which results? What was the level of significance? What was the actual difference between groups? Again, this has to be concise, but it needs to be summarized for us to be able to really evaluate your abstract as you want it to, and for us to know what you did. And then finally, if you can put a figure or table in, that clarifies things. Just put something in the abstract so people know to look for it. It's very easy when you're reading a lot of abstracts to run through these things, and if you don't see a reference to a figure, you might not see the figure that's attached to the bottom of the page. And so this is a way of making sure that your reviewers are doing their due diligence and know to look for that additional information. And finally, conclusions. This is shorter, so I'll just kind of read it. Simulation depth appears to be regarded as an important part of realism that does not detract from perceived learning and knowledge retention. The subpopulation of learners likely to carry the emotional effect of manic and death forward into future simulation-based activities may exist. Negative emotions that arise can be mitigated by debriefing, and we offer this as a guide to future research. So again, first of all, we interpreted the results clearly and honestly. We gave an interpretation that wasn't based on what we wanted to find, but was based on what we did find. It's very frequent. I not only have done them for IPSS and for IMSH, but I'm one of the associate editors for simulation healthcare. And one of the things that I see frequently come through are discussions and results that really don't match what the results say. The results clearly imply one thing, and the discussion seems to clearly imply what it seemed the authors wanted it to say up front. That's not the right way to go about this. You need to write your results in such a fashion that they clearly reflect the results and they honestly present what's going on. Also, don't overstate things. If your results are suggestive at best, use that kind of language. Very few things that we do in these abstracts are going to sort of be definitive ideological proofs of what's going on. But they can be very suggestive. So make sure your language and the strength of the language matches the strength of your findings. When we see that, that tells us that you're thinking about what you wrote. That tells us that the rest of the presentation is likely to be very thoughtful too. That tells us we probably want to give you an oral. We talked about findings that might lead to future work. If you have the room, identifying next steps really shows that you're trying to actually advance the community forward in this. And then finally, if there's any practical aspects of your work that might actually make a difference in day-to-day practice, throw a sentence in about that, highlight that, help people to know why they should care about your work, why this might affect the simulation they do tomorrow. Here's some pitfalls that I frequently see with abstracts, and again, these are things that I've mentioned to some extent. Number one, too much background. You have 250 words or maybe 400 words, and you've eaten up 150 of them on background. You don't want to do that. You want to save room for your methods. Just not enough description of what was done. 2 or 3 sentences in the methods that says we compared 2 groups is rarely enough. I have seen people put methods and results in abstracts with no actual numbers for a quantitative piece. Numbers are vital. Insufficient description of analytic methods. Statistical comparisons were applied is simply not enough. We need to know which ones you used, because if those of us that are reading these have done this work before, and if we see this and we don't know that the statistical test you chose actually matches the design you chose for the study or the type of data that your study is likely to yield, then we can't know whether it was done right. If we can't know whether it was done right and it's not in the abstract, there really is no opportunity for revision in the abstract process. We can't ask questions, and so we would have to reject in that case. So give us the information that we need to make that good choice. No specific data in results section. Again, this may be surprising, but I've seen this. I've seen results that just say significant changes were noted. That's not enough. What were the numbers? What were the changes? What are the p-values? If you've done them, what are the effect sizes? Give specifics. And then finally, over-interpreted results. It's my favorite Activision pitfall cartridge slide I use for all talks in which the word pitfall is brought up. For innovations and for work in progress, how does this change things? Well, for innovations, again, you want to focus primarily on the problem to be solved and the approach your team took. So again, you want to focus on the methods. Give enough background so that we know the problem is important, but really give us a deep description about what you did. Use that space to give us details about the kind of innovation you built, how you built it, where you implemented it, things of that nature. If you have the evaluation, that can go under results. That's important if you can have that. For ideas, works in progress, again, the proposed approach is as important as the idea itself. A good idea is not enough for ideas and works in progress. We have to see some evidence that you've thought through it as thoroughly as possible given the stage that you're in. Because again, we're judging ideas and works in progress based on our likely ability to get you to the conference, give you a chance to present your idea and works in progress, and then give you the assistance, help, and support you need to make it really successful. If we don't know enough to be able to gauge whether we can do that, it's likely to be ranked low. So final part of this talk, and then we'll transition to question and answer. I think I've left enough time for some good Q&A ideally here. Behind the scenes, how does the abstract evaluation process work? So this is a written outline of it, and I'll go over it, but I also have a flow chart for those that are more visual. So first of all, we try to get 3 individuals that are external to the program committee to review the abstracts. That's when you send it in. We will send it to 3 individuals and try to get their scores. I'll show you the rubric in a minute. Next, we collate those scores, and we initially determine means and standard deviations for each category. Now, I will tell you that this is not a hard and fast cutoff. You know, our goal in this is to get as many people as is reasonable based on what's being submitted into the conference as possible. Different conferences have different acceptance rates. You know, we try to be as inclusive as possible, but we still go through the exercise of calculating a mean and standard deviation, because really it's those abstracts that are below a standard deviation, below the mean, that we are seriously thinking about not including. Although, again, we give each one an individual evaluation, regardless of that score, to make sure that that everybody is getting a fair and adequate assessment of their work and can come to the conference if possible. We then discuss the program committee about the number of available oral presentation sessions. This usually has to do with a lot of pragmatic concerns. How many rooms do we have? How many per time per day? How many long do we have with each room? And we'll use that to get an estimate of exactly how many oral presentation slots we have. We divide those up amongst the highest abstracts in each category. We award the orals, and then the remainder are accepted that are not rejected or accepted as poster sessions. So that's the general process. For those of you that, and I'm going to go a little bit beyond IPSSW here just to give some general advice. For those of you that go to other conferences, the actual acceptance rates can vary dramatically. So I happen to know the acceptance rates for IMSH as a comparator for ours, and they're probably in the 66 to 68, maybe 70% acceptance rate for all abstracts going in. So a little lower. There are some conferences that only accept 20 to maybe 30 to 40%. A final thing that can be useful to think about, I know many people often are concerned that, you know, I got my abstract accepted to a conference, maybe even gotten an award at the conference, and yet I'm having a hard time getting into a journal. And so, unless you've seen behind the scenes, you wouldn't necessarily know this. But the reality is that conference acceptance rates are typically much higher than journal acceptance rates. So again, acceptance rates between IPSS and IMSH tend to range between 70 to 90%. Again, the journal that I serve as an associate editor for, Simulation Healthcare, is closer to 12%. So just be aware that acceptance at a conference as an abstract does not guarantee acceptance as a paper. It doesn't say that it won't either. And the goal of every conference abstract, in my opinion, if it's strong enough or if it's good research, should be to submit it as a paper in a peer-reviewed journal. That's what we should be shooting for. But keep in mind that those differences do exist. And I'm happy to comment more on that later in the questions if anybody has any. But those differences do exist, and so just keep that in mind as you make that transition from conference presentation to paper to manuscript. Here's a visual display. This is really just a visual representation of what I just said. For those that are more visual learners, 3 reviews, score collation, we determine acceptance threshold. At this point, we begin to make, we get an idea of what abstracts will likely reject. And then after discussing the number of slots, we divide between the top and the bottom, divide between orals and poster presentations based on relative scoring. This final slide is what our scoring rubric is. As you can see, we've tried to create a fairly straightforward one that can be applied to all abstracts. We have, for research proposals, we have a fairly lengthy description of what strength of research proposal means. for instructional proposals, which refers more to the workshops. We have a description as to what that means, and then the opportunity to give a 1 through 5 rating. And then for importance of topic, we again we have a similar division between a design for each one, for research, for instructional, and the same rating. So basically we're rating on 2 things. One is strength of the methodology, proposal, or design, and the other is the importance of what is being done. And then finally we ask questions about acceptance or rejection for awards, and acceptance, just a general thought as to whether the abstract should be accepted or rejected for the conference. And we will look at these separately. We'll look at the scores as one indicator, and then we'll look as a second indicator at whether people indicate whether the abstract should be accepted or rejected. If something gets low scores, but everybody thinks it should be accepted, and particularly if like this would be a good poster, we're much more likely to take it as a poster than if it's mostly no's. And so we use that to kind of corroborate the scores that we obtain. That's the end of the didactic part of this. I hope that's cleared up a bit of how the system works and how you can maybe better take advantage of it. But we have a decent amount of time left, and so I'm wide open for questions or discussion if anybody has any, and I'll turn it back over to Elaine.
Thanks, Aaron. That was super informative and enlightening. We have time for questions, so take some time. You guys can submit written questions by typing them on the webinar's control panel. So I, of course, have tons of questions, and so I'm going to start asking while you guys type. So now, is it okay to do a repeat submission? So I submit it to somewhere else, and it was already accepted somewhere else. Can I submit to multiple conferences? Is that cool?
It's a great question, Elaine. I would say that by and large it is. I think the issues with that come into play with the publication of those abstracts. So I would look into, if you're doing that, whether the abstract is published in a journal where there might be copyright issues. If there are any changes in the abstract, like if there's additional data or something, it's easily fair game. But if it's an identical abstract, I would say, number one, try to vary the language a bit because it can get away from that issue. And although it's typically okay to do that, some conferences will publish the work in a journal. And so then there could be copyright issues there if they're getting published, if the same abstract is getting published in 2 journals. So ask about their publication is what I would say. Always check, but usually it's fine. And if you've changed the abstract in any real meaningful way, it's definitely fine.
Okay. So following on that, so let's say I submitted it now in November, December to IPSSW. By the time I come to present it in April, May, I've accumulated more data. Can I present it as something not entirely different, but like with more data and maybe even a different conclusion by then?
Yes, I actually think that that's what should be done, given that we know that there's a big difference. We know that some of these things are in motion, especially if it's something like a work in progress. If you have more data by that point, then by all means, present that. We can't really change the category, but for sure, many abstracts are submitted based on an initial set of findings with more forthcoming. And so, yes, that's totally legitimate to do. Okay. You won't get a chance, I will say that you won't get a chance to change the abstract. So the original abstract is what you submitted. But when it comes to the final presentation or poster, updates are welcome.
Okay. So in terms of work in progress, that's really difficult to write, I find. I mean, you clearly suggested what the categories are for research. That's easy. Work in progress is like an idea. I haven't really done much about it. I am planning to do I'm just about to get IRB. I am planning to do a qualitative or whatever I'm doing. And I expect to find some differences to prove my hypothesis. Like, that's really hard to write. It's like, how do we kind of write the results section or even the conclusion section?
You don't, is what I would say. I would focus primarily on the methods. And I think for the results and conclusions, what you can write is a bit about what you're expecting to find or what you'd like to do with the results once you find them, is what I would say. It's okay in this to say, you say, let me think about an example. Given previous studies in this area, we expect to be able to indicate this, although the results themselves will kind of be what they are, to not use the most scientific language in the moment here. And then you could also, for your conclusions, perhaps recite why you think the results of the study, regardless of what they are, will be of value to the community. So, but I would focus for work in progress. I would put the bulk of your time on making sure that we know exactly what your plan is, because that's where the evaluation is going to be. We get it that you don't have results. That's okay.
Right. So it has to be more than an idea. Got to have a plan on how to study. That I will take these students and divide them to two groups and do a comparison and that kind of thing. I can't be just an idea.
Exactly right. We should know what you're intending to do. We should know what you're trying to do and develop. And again, the value of presenting an ideas and works in progress, from my opinion, is not just to sort of get into the conference, but it's because at a conference like IPSS, you're going to have experts from all around the world. And I have often found that my ideas, my works in progress, when I get into that environment, get changed and get worked on and shifted in some very vital ways that have ultimately made the final study a lot more successful. So I would say go into an ideas or works in progress abstract with the idea that you're going to get feedback on your preliminary plan so that you can then hopefully shift the study or shift the project so that it's even more successful than it would have been.
Okay. All right. I just undocked technical issues here. I was thinking, oh my God, there's no questions. There are actually tons of questions.
Oh, good. Okay.
So I have to stop asking mine, even though I have more. Anyways, Geeta said, thank you. Oh, Geeta didn't have a question. What are the common pitfalls you see when presenting posters? I might just jump into here.
Sure.
Because we're going to do a thing on how to do posters later. But the question is, what are the common pitfalls you see when presenting posters? I don't know if you want to say a little something.
Yeah, I can share a bit on that. And I would say the single biggest pitfall is too many words on the poster. Posters are more like infographics. Not that I'm an expert in infographics, but in general, it's tempting to basically write out a semi-research paper and just plug all the paragraphs on the posters. The only thing that I let myself on a poster put in terms of paragraph format is maybe a bit of background. But in terms of the methods, the results, do as much large font bullet pointing as you can so that there's not so much text that people get distracted. And I usually reserve the middle of a poster for, graphs, images, diagrams, things like that kind of draw the eye and can really communicate what you've done in a visual way. So a poster is a visual medium. I would just say use it as such. Don't use it as a written medium, if that makes sense.
And the part B to this question is, what are the common pitfalls you see when presenting oral presentations?
Trying to fit too much in. I think the hardest thing to do is if you put a study in or an innovation in, you are so immersed in that work that you want to literally share every single detail with the rest of the world. And the issue is a 5-minute or a 10-minute time slot is really short. So I would say try as hard as you can to stick to one slide per 1 minute, because I guarantee you're going to want to put a lot of info on those slides, and it'll probably go longer than that. Pace yourself, time yourself, and just make sure that you leave adequate space at the end for questions, because that's where a lot of the really interesting stuff happens. So again, don't try to squeeze too much into a short time frame. Be appropriately abbreviated in what you're saying while still hitting all the important points.
Great, thank you. If that answers the question, great. If not, you guys can put in some more questions. So here's another one. I'm just going to read it. I was considering my research in progress until listening to your description. So study is developed and in full swing collecting data, but seeing as though it's an educational program, I'll end as far as 5. And I therefore thought it would be considered a work in progress, but I don't have any questions for the community. Should I then submit it in the research section?
I think that's kind of a hard one, because I'd first say, when is the deadline? Are you going to have any preliminary results by the deadline? If you're going to have some preliminary results at the very least, I think you can put it in as a completed abstract, a completed research abstract, and then just fill in the rest of the results as you've analyzed them at the end. I think for it to fit in the completed abstract category, you have to have at least some results. The other option is if there was a significant program developed as part of that work, and it's not really so much focused on the questions on, evaluating the educational work, that could fit as innovation, depending on the level of innovation of the project. So that's an option too. Finally, I'd say if you're in a position where you're not going to have any results by the time the submission deadline hits, you're probably still better off putting it as an ideas and work in progress and just writing in your results section that the project is currently underway and results should be available by the time of the conference. And so it'll be kind of in a bit of a no man's land, but that's okay. We're forgiving on that kind of stuff. And in that case, the discussion of the conference would not be about how to shape the project, but it'd be about maybe how to move things forward for the next level of research with it, if that kind of makes sense. So I would base it entirely on when the results are going to, what results you have, when they're going to be done. But if you have any results at all, you could probably put it in as a research abstract, as long as there's something there to be included.
Great. I remember last year at IPSSW, we actually, for the poster presentations, we lumped the research, the innovations, and the work in progress together. So it wasn't just one group of pure research and one group of pure innovation. So at least the exchange of ideas is always going to be there. Because you would think, oh, those guys are so high-powered, they do research, and I only have an idea. But it wasn't that way, was it?
No, it wasn't that way at all, and that's really not how the conference works. I mean, this is a remarkably accessible conference in terms of getting people from all over the place and all levels of experience to talk and converse. And so, I wouldn't feel intimidated about putting something in the research category, especially if you have at least some preliminary numbers, or in a case of a qualitative, some preliminary analysis.
I noticed that in your 4 categories for submitting a abstract, there isn't one for references. What about that? Do we put that in or don't put that in, or just make it 1 or 2 as opposed to 5 or 6? What do we do about that?
I think if you want to put a few references in, and I have to be honest, I don't remember exactly how the IPSSW submission system handles references, but honestly, I would base that on whether or not they count against your word count. I don't think any of us that review abstracts are looking for the references. If there is a separate reference entry box that does not count against your abstract's primary word count, and you have a few references, go on and throw them in. But I don't think anybody's counting references or lack thereof against you. I definitely wouldn't put in more than 5.
All right, thank you. I think those are all the questions, but just making sure I don't have any technical issues. Can you double check? Because I think that's all the questions there were.
Let's see. I'm trying to figure out how to get there myself, because I don't have question view on my.
Oh, I have my questions view, so I'm double checking and double checking. So it seems that's about it. Is there anything else you want to say now that we've asked you a few things, or you've pretty much told us everything, which is just go write an abstract?
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is my final thought would be just, it's always good to have somebody else read your abstract. Give yourself enough time to write it and write it well. And it's always good to run these things by somebody else from your division, your department, your hospital, whatever, just to make sure that something that makes perfect sense to you makes perfect sense to other people. There are plenty of things I've written that made perfect sense to me and made 0 sense to other people, and I'm thankful they told me about it. And so that's always, I think, an important thing to ask and just to do as a regular thing. I would also say, if your abstract is accepted, take advantage of the people at your local institution. Present to them. Do your presentation ahead of time. It's going to make it a lot easier at the conference. It'll be a lot less nerve-wracking because you'll already have gone over it once. And ideally, the people that are in your department, division, or your location, your program, can ask a lot of the questions that you might get asked there, so you have a preview of what they could ask. I think that's a good thing to plan on anyway. And the final thing is always be asking as you go through this process, how can I take the abstract farther? How can I turn this into potentially a full manuscript in a journal of some sort? I think it's a true statement that there is a journal for every paper, almost. And so if you get rejected for one, keep looking. I didn't give those stats about acceptance rates to be discouraging to submit to a journal. I actually gave that to kind of disambiguate why sometimes it can seem like you've got a lot of abstracts in, and this happened to me too. But they don't seem to be having as much luck. You don't seem to be having as much luck getting them in as papers. That's just a call to recognize that discrepancy so you're not surprised. But that doesn't mean don't do it. That's the right progress. That's the right progression. that's what you should be doing. So move forward with that. Submit things, find journals that seem to fit your work, and try to continue to get your work out there after the conference is over. Ultimately, all of our goals in doing the work that we do is to make a difference in the patients we care for, but also to make a difference in the practices and lives of others that are trying to care for their patients other places. And that's what these conference presentations and papers and abstracts do. They let you make a difference at a place that you might never really visit. And it gives you a chance to extend the reach of what you're doing to hopefully help even more people. And so take advantage of those opportunities and keep trying to get your stuff out there. It's valuable.
Yeah, that's really wise words. So I think we'll conclude our webinar. Thank you all for participating. Thank you, Erin, for presenting such a fascinating to me because all the inside workings of how abstracts are reviewed. The participants will get an email from IPSS that includes a link for an evaluation. So please take a few minutes to access it and provide your feedback on today's session. So today's webinar is recorded with the handouts and will be posted on the IPSS website in the near future. So as a reminder, IPSSW 2020 is currently accepting abstract submissions through November 18th. If you or someone you know may be interested, please make sure to submit your work. And so we can look out for our information on our website. There's actually going to be 2 new presentation format types.
I just saw that. I was going to say that if you didn't.
What's that?
I just saw that. I was going to say it if you didn't.
Yeah, so one's called Immersive Simulation Workshop, and there's an instructional workshop. So both of which will take place at Johns Hopkins Sim Center in Tampa. And yes, that's where the IPSSW 2020 meeting is going to be. It's going to be held jointly in St. Petersburg and Tampa, Florida from April 26th to 29th. And so we hope to see you there. So once again, thank you very much for joining us and have a good afternoon or evening or wherever you are.